Welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. I'm Ryan.
Hey, and I'm Brian.
And this is the
Bible Bistro, a Bible podcast
about the Bible, theology, and all things related to the Christian faith.
I will say no more.
This
This is an exciting day, though.
It is an exciting day. Brian, why is it such an exciting day?
Well, here's the reason it's exciting. We're together finally at last.
Yes.
We were apart for so long, and now we're in the same room. We've had good food. We're going to have more good food later, which is all the bistro is all about good food.
Well, we are in Bloomington.
Yeah.
And we're in, what is this, Bistro West?
West, yeah.
I saw you across the cornfield, and we ran to each other.
Technically, we're in the spacious studios of Broadleaf
Video production.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we're thankful to them for
so if you're in the Bloomington Normal area for all of your or Central Illinois for all your video production needs, contact Broadleaf Video. So, but it's also my brother. So, family plug there. So check that out. But we are back in the studio. We're back together again. It's nice to be back together. We had a meal.
Yes.
We didn't just like video chat, Zoom each other, watching each other eat. We were actually at a table eating a meal.
We've never done that. By the way, I just want to say that. Plus, it's exciting because you guys are going to really like this part of Daniel. I think you're going to like this part of Daniel, Ryan. I think our listeners.
I'm excited for Daniel. Daniel, as we talked last week, there's a split. There's something that happens in there.
Yeah,
and it gets. I'm excited / Trepidatious. Oh, that's a very good word, Mr. Linguist, about where we go from that. But yes, we're jumping into Daniel 1. I think this is going to be a great series because there's a lot happening here.
Yeah, there is. And I think it's good. Yeah, I think there's of course, the Bible relates to our situation anyway, I think, once we understand, the meaning. But I think that I think there's some really interesting things here that's going on in the first part of Daniel. So that's what we're going to be looking at.
Well, I'm interested to get into the interesting things.
Well, Daniel 1, I thought we would do all of chapter 1 today is what we're thinking about.
Yes.
I encourage you to go ahead and read it ahead of time and come up with some questions. So I'll see if you've got anything to kind of stump me.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if I have anything to stump you.
I know you read it.
Yes, I did read it, but I don't know if I have anything to stump you. So
here is kind of when I think about Daniel 1, I think about the issue of influence. And I'm going to show you why that is in the story, I think. But what do you think? How do you become influential, or what? Here's the term today, right? And what's
talking to the wrong person. I have yet to unlock that lock.
We use this term, and it wasn't even a term, 10 years ago? Influencer, right? Maybe 20 years ago. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know how you become one now. You sell your soul to the internet.
Well, but influence is a big deal. I mean, we think about it. How do you influence people? And what's interesting here is to see how Daniel and his friends, I say they were the original influencers, right? They had
Did they have a giant hat
they had an influence far beyond their station in life, is what I would say. And so I think there's things to learn about, what they make a difference in their society in a way that would be unexpected. Because if I said to you, well, how, and again, you said this is the wrong person, but if what we think about how you influence someone, right, is usually through, you need a big platform, you need, it's just really interesting. I think you'll like this story. So we read a little bit, we did the introduction to Daniel last week. You might want to go back there and listen to that if you haven't done that yet. But Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, we talked about a bit. It gives us the historical setting. Do you want to go ahead and read those two verses for us?
Yeah, absolutely. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God.
So this is really kind of setting up the conflict we're going to see throughout the entire book of Daniel. I've often said if I ever wrote a book on, I'm not a good writer. That's why I do things like podcasts. But if I were ever to write a book on Daniel, I would call it "There's a God in Heaven," and we'll see that actually next chapter. But it's this contrast between Yahweh, the God of Israel, and the God of Nebuchadnezzar, because he takes these articles from the temple, right? And it's funny. The very first part of, I didn't even spend too much time talking about this, but I won't spend a lot of time talking about it. Daniel 1. These first two verses really almost entirely are taken verbatim from Jeremiah, from First Chronicles. The stories that we have there of the end of Israel and what took place there is what we see here. That Nebuchadnezzar comes, he lays siege to Jerusalem, and then he carries away these articles and he puts them in the temple of his God. We're going to see these articles later, by the way.
Yes.
But that's where we kind of begin with it. And then he doesn't just take articles. He also takes, I would say, the best and brightest of the people. Let me read a little bit. This is verses 3-5. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz. I'm going to stop here. I don't know whether I should say this or not, but I'm saying it anyway. Ashpenaz is last week, I just mentioned this briefly, that there are some people who talk about that there are some anachronisms in Daniel that make it seem like it was maybe written later.
Mm-hmm.
Ashpenaz is one of that name is a Persian name. And so that causes some people to say, what's going on. But we're going to see there could be people with the same names. Anyway, we'll come back to this. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, king of the court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Okay, so they were to be young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand. All this, there's lots of very similar kind of ideas. Well-informed, open to learning, quick to learn, qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them, this is Ashpenaz's job, to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. So they're going to kind of get a crash course. They're taking these Israelite young men, bringing them to Babylonia and giving them a crash course on basically Babylonian culture.
Worldview.
Yeah, this is exactly it. And this is like I said, the conflict that we're going to see here is really, that's what it's setting up.
Conflict of visions.
Yes, I think so. And so the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. The idea from the king's table would have been the richest, the best kind of food, and they were to be trained for 3 years. And after that, they were entered the king's service. So he's taking some of these people. It's an interesting concept, the idea that he's going to take some of these captives and he's going to give them training in Babylonian, like I said, culture kind of, and then he was going to use them in the court. It would have been interesting because, first of all, we're going to see one of the concerns that Nebuchadnezzar seems to have is, how am I going to maintain my empire? It's one thing to conquer a bunch of nations, but then how do you make them into a cohesive group? And one of the ideas he has, I think, is to use in his court some of these young men. The other thing is, you're taking people from diverse backgrounds. In other words, they've had different kinds of learning where they were, and they're able to bring the strength of what they've learned previously into his court. So it's not just, when I say just like an echo chamber, just like kind of one kind of an idea. And so I think it's a brilliant concept is what he does. So
yeah, he's taking the leaders of a conquered people,
exactly,
and kind of bringing them close, and also giving them his education,
shaping them. So
bringing them to the dark side.
The people we're going to meet here are young men, and we're gonna learn a little bit more about them. Now, what he's teaching them really is kind of this idea of divination. That's what he's going to use them in court. Kind of the background and I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by divination in a minute. But the background of kind of the Babylonian system was, you're looking for portents or signs. You're looking to the gods to see if you can get information, and that's going to be important in the stories that we kind of look at in the next little bit in Daniel. And so verses 6 and 7, we're introduced to the heroes of our story. I'm going to read this too, because there's lots of names here that I'm going to slow down and kind of look at these, because I think here, this is really an interesting place that we see this kind of clash of worldviews. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah. So these are, well, I'll just say that right now. Daniel, who we know is the title of the book, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official, so that's Ashpenaz again, the chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. Now, the interesting thing is, I think the names themselves here are kind of a very clear example of this way that he's trying to mold them to think in a different kind of way, because their names themselves. The change is a worldview kind of thing. Daniel's name in Hebrew means God is my judge. Okay, Daniel. So L's the word for God, and Dani is my judge. So God is my judge is what his name means. And what he does is he gives him the name Belteshazzar, and you can see in there, if you know the name Bel. Does that make any sense to you? Bel, we sometimes use the term Baal.
Oh yeah.
But Bel is a name for one of the Babylonian gods. Look in just quickly, turn to chapter 4, verse 8 for me,
Okay.
of Daniel, and I think you'll see an example of this.
Okay. Daniel 4.
Verse 8.
Okay. Yep. You want to read this here?
Yeah.
At last Daniel came in before me, he who was named Belteshazzar, after the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods.
Okay. So you can see he's saying, I named it Belteshazzar after my God.
My God.
So Belteshazzar in Akkadian, which is the language that was used in Babylon at this time, it means probably something like, and there's kind of unclear in some ways, but probably what this means is, may Bel protect the king. And we're going to see a lot of similar names. So that Shazar and Nebuchadnezzar, you hear similar kinds of sounds. And you're going to pick up some of these meanings. But may Bel protect the king is kind of the idea. So he goes from God is my judge to may Bel protect the king. I think that's the clearest example. Let me tell you the other one since we're on this. Hananiah in Hebrew means Yahweh has been gracious. Hananiah, that Yah is the Yahweh there. So Yahweh has been gracious to me, basically, something like that. And instead, it becomes Shadrach or Shudaraku, which means Aku is the name of the moon god in Babylonian, and so it means something like it's some kind of a reference to the moon. And I'll say there's some debate on these names. I should have said this at the beginning. There's some debate about the meaning, and sometimes we even think that the Hebrew writer, like Daniel, would have maybe changed some of the names to kind of show the messed up nature of this kind of thing too. And here's the clearest example of this, I think. So you got Shadrach, or no, not this one. Mishael means who is what God is, or basically who's like God. Mishael, there you see the L again, and his name is changed to Meshach, which is very similar, except there's that Aku again. Meshach, who's like Aku. So his name goes from who is like God to who is like...
Or like all these names are kind of like a perversion of what they once were.
And I'll say, I've lived in places where there are more than one culture at work. Like I talk about this in the Dominican Republic, where you have Haitian culture and you have Spanish, like a Spanish-speaking culture. And sometimes people will have multiple names. But it's very interesting that he's giving these names. And in fact, I'll say something about this in just a moment. It's an interesting feature of the language as well, but they're giving these names to them. They're determining basically that these are what their names are going to be. And so Mishael becomes Meshach. It's a part of the, what's the word I'm looking like, an indoctrination, really.
Yeah. It by changing a name, learning the language, learning the literature. I mean, it's as much of a cultural cutoff as you can try to make. Like,
it is.
How can I reshape your brain?
And identity. I mean, think about our names, how close they are to our identity. And so to change that, I've had a couple of interesting experiences with this. One, I have a friend who's changed his name a couple of times because he didn't really like his name at all. But I mean, that's very central to who you are, to your identity. Here was the other thing I was just thinking about when I was doing some research and studying on this. You're too young, and most of our listeners are probably way too young to remember.
I don't feel young.
Do you remember? This is back when there were things called miniseries. They weren't streaming series, right? But this was on. It was a TV event. We used to have TV events, right? And it was Roots. Alex Haley's Roots, which was this really famous book that had been written. It was this ambitious thing to make it into a miniseries, and it was a really incredibly received miniseries. Do you remember that? Did you ever see that? See, I told you you're too young. But as a young person, particularly watching that, there was one scene that really stood out. It was a young, who's the Reading Rainbow guy?
Oh, I don't know.
Geordie LaForge in Star Trek. Now all of our
Okay.
listeners are shouting at the
The person who's on Reading Rainbow. Go ahead.
LeVar Burton, a young LeVar Burton, I think is who it is. Now I may be wrong, but he's been brought from West Africa to the United States to be made a slave. He's been sold into slavery. And as the slave master, it's a very intense scene. And again, as a young person, I remember very clearly the slave master is trying to get to him to adopt an American name, an English name. And he keeps beating him with a whip, basically, and saying, your name is, and I can't remember what it is now. I can't remember what the name is that he's trying to get him to adopt, John or something like that. And he keeps saying, I remember this very clearly, my name is Kunta Kinte. So he's basically saying, my name is, this is what my name was given, and it was important to him. So that came to my mind, and this idea is a similar kind of thing. They're saying, this is what we're going to call you from now on. Now, it's interesting to me, there's one more name we have to talk about here. It's interesting to me, too. We know the name of Daniel, but we don't call the others Hananiah and Azariah and Mishael. We call them Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Yeah.
We call them by their Akkadian, their Babylonian names that they're given.
Yeah.
Here's the last one, and it's Abednego, which means something like, and it's probably actually a corruption of Abednego. It's probably something Daniel changed, but you can actually see Nebo or Nabu in the name Nebuchadnezzar. And that's the son of Marduk is Nabu, is a god of, it's an agricultural god, God. And so the name Nebuchadnezzar is something like, may Nabu guard the boundaries, basically,
Okay.
keep the empire together.
So all of these names, it's like it's some perversion of like a god in the name.
Exactly. Abednego, if that's what it was, Abednego, if that's what it was, would be something like servant of Nabu, this god. And if I've never told you guys, I think I've told the story of Marduk and Tiamat before, but I'll tell the story another time if I haven't. But Marduk's son, Nabu, then, according to their creation myth and according to their hierarchy. So anyway, that was a long way to go on that, one part.
Well, it was a little bit of a route, yeah. But it's interesting to again, we don't have that context. There's cultural context here. It's not in the text, but it really sets up this battle of sorts between Yahweh and these other guys.
And let me go back to 7 again. It says the chief official gave them. This is in the NIV, gave them. And that verb, gave, is the same verb that is used in verse 8. There's a little play on words here, I think, where it says, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself. That's the same verb
as gave and resolved.
And so there's a translator. This is a Golden Gaze translation in his Word Biblical Commentary. He translates it this way: the head of the staff determined on names for them, and then Daniel determined that he would not contaminate themselves. So you see that kind of battle of wills there.
Digging in a little bit.
Yeah. So he basically I determined, here's what we're going to call you, and Daniel's like, oh, I'm determined not to, contaminate myself, is basically the idea. So go ahead and read 8 through 10 for me, if you would, so move on.
But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age, so you would endanger my head with the king?
So Daniel asked not to be defiled in this way, which I think tells us kind of what the primary issue is here. Because Daniel would have been taught to have certain
dietary restrictions,
clean and unclean laws. And the food that came from the king's table, he would have had no way to know if it had been, kosher, for what the term we would use. Rich foods, probably exotic kind of foods that would have been given. And so what he has, and so there's a lot of people have done weird things with this text. Let's be frank. That they've taken kind of the idea of the the water and vegetables as the Daniel diet and all this kind of stuff.
Yes.
They've talked about why does he choose this particular diet? Well, vegetables and water you could trust. You could know that those would not have been cooked in an inappropriate way, because it wasn't only the meat. A lot of people think that the meat is the only thing that makes something clean or unclean, but the book of Leviticus is clear that it's the way that the animal is killed as well. So if you kill an animal in a way that leaves the blood in it rather than draining the blood, then it's not something that you should eat, and those kind of things. And so vegetables you can count on, right?
Right. They don't have to be drained of anything.
Right.
Just drained of flavor.
Yeah, I was gonna say they're carrots or potatoes or whatever, whatever they had. But he says to do this. Now it's interesting that Ashpenaz responds to Daniel's request in a way. Again, this shows that this is a worldview issue as well. And it comes down to this: is he says, well, I can't do this because then look how much worse you're going to look than the other young men, and then the king's going to have my head. Basically, he's going to
know that you've.
And so his view is, well, eating these richer foods are clearly what's going to make you healthier, rather than the diet that you've decided to take on. But the issue here again isn't really. I would say it's not the nutrition. It's not saying, oh, vegetables are better for you. It has to do with Daniel saying, I refuse to be coerced into partaking in this culture. And that's really what this whole thing's about. Because here you have these, and by the way, we talked about this in the introduction last week. I said, if Daniel lived these 70 years, and let's imagine he's 85 at the end of this book, he's probably 15 to 20. He's a young man. He's a probably, and he has his friends, probably teenagers here in a foreign culture, right? And obviously being indoctrinated and given these ways to think differently, given these different names, everything done to break their will in a sense and to accept the Babylonian way is what's going on here, and they're refusing. And that, I think, is really at the heart of what this first chapter is about. So one of the things I think we have to think about in any book, I always talk about this, is when would this book have been written? If this book is written, as I believe, and we talked a little bit about last week, I believe it's written right at the end of Daniel's life. It's written in a time where the return from exile is just getting ready to take place. The Medes and the Persians have now defeated the Babylonians. Israelites are getting ready to go back into the
Cyrus
land.
is letting them go back.
But the question is, how are we to live, now that we're going back into this place where there are foreign invaders who've come in? They're not invaders, but other nations have been placed there. How are we to live in this way? And Daniel, I think, provides an example, like there are other books similar to this, provides an example of how to be a faithful follower of God in the midst of a pagan culture, is really what a lot of these stories are about.
Yeah. It's really interesting. It reminds me, we went to that retreat with Jody Owens talking about how Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, like these are books that are written probably close to around the same time, like while they're in Babylonian captivity. How did you get here? And then we have Daniel's example as if it's written before they return. Like, here's how to live. Here's what got you here in the first place, but here's how to live faithfully in this new context you're going back to.
So you think about it, you think about the book of Esther, another good example in that kind of thing. Intertestamental books like Tobit, we've talked about before, is really about that. Some of the additions to Daniel, things like the story of Susanna, which is an addition to this book of Daniel, is about that same kind of a thing. How do you resist someone trying to force you into giving up your faith, essentially?
Yeah, I mean, and those are going to be important concepts that take them even through that intertestamental period. What I mean? Like, there's so much that happens. This isn't going to be the last time this happens to them. Like, this is setting up a prime example of how do you live in the midst of these contexts and still stay faithful to Yahweh in this.
Right. One thing I passed over pretty quickly, but I want to come back to is I noticed there it says God caused Ashpenaz to show favor. Actually, it says favor and compassion. Favor is the word chesed that you may have heard that word before, but God's kind of his mercy or his favor. We could say maybe even almost the concept of a grace. And then also this idea of compassion, rahamim, is a very strong kind of a love. He had a love for him. He had a strong feeling for him. And it says God caused Ashpenaz to show this kind of favor to him. So we've talked before about this idea of how God interacts with human freedom or human free will and those kind of things. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that, or if you wanted to talk about that at all.
Yeah, I think that is really interesting to think. And God gave Daniel favor. It's God is working in the midst of this, and I think that, God has used a specific people through all of this. And I think it's interesting here in the midst of this, Daniel is used in this way, that God is opening doors for him.
Yeah.
And I think it's, Daniel took the first step in it though.
Yeah. Fair point.
You know what I mean? Like that's
Fair
one thing
point.
that I think about is like, that Daniel's taking the first step, and doing it, and then God's opening the doors as Daniel's taking that step.
Okay. I find the other thing I wanted to talk about here is I find the enormity of what Daniel's asking here can be seen. And basically Ashpenaz is saying, if I defy my king's orders in this, it could get me killed. And again, put yourself in him and his friend's shoes. Foreign country, being forced into this, you're a young person, and to have I almost said the chutzpah, that's probably not the right word to use, but to have the the will, the strength of will to say, we're not going to, do what's against our beliefs, against what God has taught us. It's a very serious issue. This isn't just some kind of like, oh, we'd rather, I don't like chicken nuggets, so I'd rather just have some French fries.
Yeah, I mean, this is a violation of their being in some ways. I mean, like I think that's, I think we see in Daniel, this is not a flippant belief in Yahweh.
Right.
Like this is, this is a belief that is incorporated in his daily life, and it involves the food I eat. Like it's a whole life discipleship issue.
Right.
And that's why it's like, hey, we're at a crossroads here with this. And that, I don't know if that was what you want me to say about God using, God making a way for him. But like, as I read it, the thing that I see is like Daniel has held on to it, and Daniel, as he exercises, like fidelity,
right.
God makes
Blesses
a way for him,
that.
blesses his fidelity
Yeah.
to him in that.
Kind of a way maker there. Is that what you're saying? Go ahead with
Brian is goading me right now.
Read verses 11 through 14 for me.
Oh my
We'll
God.
come back to that maybe. Daniel proposes a test here is what, and it's an interesting, this word test we see other places, here's a test to see if this is going to work.
And I'm reading the ESV here.
Okay,
So, which is why the chief of the eunuchs and the chief of the staff thing that you were mentioning earlier. All right. So 11 through 14. Then Daniel said to the steward whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days.
Okay, so there's the test he proposed. Let's try it for 10 days. What can it hurt? See how it works, that kind of thing.
So 10 days is all we need to look fit and trim if we just lay off the king's food.
Yeah, who knows? But go ahead and read verses 15 and 16.
It's going to take a couple rounds of 10 days for me. What's that?
Go ahead and read verses 15 through 16 then.
15 through 16.
This is the result, basically.
At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. What is fatter in flesh?
Well, that's the ESV. It's probably the
healthier
very
in flesh or whatever.
Yeah, I mean let me read what it says here, just to give you another possibility.
I was going to say
healthier and better nourished. So
I was going to say this is not the 10-day diet for me. Then.
Which by the way is an interesting it's an interesting. It takes me to a worldview thing again. I'll come back to it maybe,
Yeah.
but yeah, fatter in flesh. Yeah.
Yeah. So the steward took away their food and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables.
So so here's my question then. What influence does Daniel and his friends have here?
Well, I mean, the chief of the eunuchs has seen the results here,
Right.
and he's like, so they have influence because now he's changing the diet for all of them.
Right. And it's interesting to me. It's not a forceful kind of thing. It's not.
It's persuasive.
It's persuasive. He's saying, I call this sometimes quiet influence, right? I'm not going to eat this, but I tell you what, let's do this for 10 days and let's see how it works. And what a difference it makes. Now we're going to see it even goes beyond this in just a minute. The story I was going to tell you about this idea of fatter and flesh. See, again, for us, fatter
is less than.
It's a cultural context, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I can remember one of the first times I traveled down to the Dominican Republic, especially Haiti, people would come up and pat me on the belly. Right.
Because you're a rich man and you're full of life.
Exactly. And at first, like when they're doing it, I'm like, oh yeah, I know I need to lose some weight. In my cultural context, the only reason you would go, hey, look here, would be like, look at you, fatty. But it was more like, hey, well done. You can afford to eat, and I tell you, really,
I've had this experience in Cambodia.
There you go. Okay. It's the same, the same kind of thing. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And again, culturally, we think, oh, fatter, but there it's the idea of better nourished. You're able to have.
You're a rich guy. You've got the means to do so. Yeah. Do you think Daniel took a photo every day? If he had a cell phone, he would have been like day one, like a reel, like day one, starting my new diet, influencer,
the original influencer,
the original influencer.
There you go.
Day 2, looking fatter.
So go ahead and read verse 17 then. This is God's provision then, I think. And I'm going to contrast this with verse 4 here in just a minute. Okay. But go ahead. Read.
Just 17?
Yeah.
As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams.
Okay, so God gives them as a result of their faithfulness. Again, here we would say, he gives them learning and understanding in all literature. Now contrast that with verse 4. Do you remember what it said in verse 4?
Just the literature of the
language and literature of the Babylonians. And so basically he's saying it's not just the Babylonian, it's a superior kind of wisdom is what we're going to see here. And then we also get introduced to this idea that Daniel is given the ability to interpret dreams. Babylonian context, this idea of divination we mentioned is a very important one. Even in the next chapter, we're going to see this tested then. This is kind of setting us up for the very next story that we're going to have in this Daniel cycle kind of thing.
Yeah, so do you see that the learning and skill and literature and wisdom and all this stuff is a result of
God's blessing on them is what I would say is God's, they're maintaining their faithfulness to God, and he's providing what they need in order to survive in the environment in which they find themselves is the way I would see this. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You want to say something about that or?
Well, I mean, it's just the same, as they have, it goes back to the original point, their fidelity.
Yeah.
It's kind of a Peter Parker. You know what I mean? With much power comes much responsibility. It's this, as they have maintained their fidelity, God has opened a door for them with the diet thing. And then as they've, and that as that door has been opened and it's causing influence, he's giving them more capacity for influence by understanding.
Go ahead and read the next 3 verses then, and then let's discuss
so I'm just
this.
saying, is this a cause and effect?
Read this, because I think this is where you're going to then.
Verse 18.
18 through 21. Just finish the chapter
At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus.
So this influence then becomes one that becomes empire-wide eventually.
Mm-hmm.
They're called to be advisors. He sees their wisdom, he sees their learning, and brings them close as advisors, and they're able to give their wisdom, the wisdom that God gives them in this context. Now, what were you saying in terms of basically increasing their their ability
Yeah, I
to
mean, I think that, we're seeing this as like Daniel said, like, oh, I'm not going to eat this food.
right?
But I think it's like, that's probably a nerve-wracking thing at this
Sure,
point. Like, you have been conquered.
it's a big
You
step.
have been
Yeah,
taken away.
yeah.
You are
You're in
not in
captivity.
charge.
Yeah,
No one here is, I mean, yes, they obviously they want something from you,
yeah.
but he's trying to take, like, not to say that he's like in total control, but saying like, hey, is there an accommodation for us here
We're
that we
gonna
can
do
do
this
this?
in
We're
my-
going to do this.
Yeah,
I
in
can't do
our-
this.
We're gonna
Like,
do it
that's
in-
got to be
Yeah,
that is countercultural to
Yeah.
the world, because
Yeah.
at this point the Babylonians are totally in charge. They're the ones that are
Yeah.
the conquering forces sweeping
exactly.
through.
Yeah,
And so you're at the mercy of them, but also stepping up to the plate to say, like, this is against.
so in that context, how remarkable that he's able to have that kind
Absolutely.
of influence then, and ends up being. It reminds the other story. It reminds me of. Does it remind you of any other Old Testament stories that you can think of?
Well, I mean, it's Esther.
Esther, Joseph's the other one that comes to mind. It's an echo of Joseph, right?
Yes.
Where he's sold into foreign slavery. He's in a difficult situation. He's in the prison. God blesses him, shows him favor, and he ends up being the head over the prison. Then, he becomes the second in command because of a dream, right? He
Right.
becomes the second in command
Right. Yeah.
over all of Egypt. And so it's a similar kind of pattern, I think, that we see here to what Daniel. It's a sign of God's. I keep using the term blessing, but I know some people that term kind of bothers them. It's a sign of God's place in Daniel's life, right? That he is and his friends are given these positions, I think, and given these. But anyway, I find this a really interesting story because we think about influence in a completely different way. A completely different kind of an idea than what we might have seen, what we might have thought of as in terms of influence in a different way. Not showy, not a power. They're not influencing from a position of power, right? So when we think about how, as believers, this is what I think we need to think about and talk about in this text. And then I'll ask you if there's some other things that you draw out here. But when we think about having influence in a culture, and you've talked about this idea of cultural creation and that kind of thing, often we feel maybe stymied because we're not in the right position, or we don't have the right. What's the term I'm looking for? We don't have everything that we need in order to have the influence that we really would like to have. But I think this lesson teaches us that even from a position of subjugation, right? But of what do we have here? We have firm conviction. We have an absolute trust in God. And I mean, here's the thing, of course, we're going to see some really incredible ways that God rescues these people. But even, I think for Daniel, even if I die, right, I am going to trust in God because I know that my entire destiny lays in his hands. And I think that's what allows him to have this kind of influence eventually in the society, is because what can be seen is his absolute faith in the God who sustains him.
Yeah, I think, firm conviction is it's not a flippant,
No.
And I think what is hard is you've just been conquered.
Right.
Like, this is not a super distant past for you.
Right.
And this reminds me in some ways when we talked about, in the episode, Was Jesus Forsaken? There's this question of like, where's God for you at this
Right.
point? And Jesus calling back to Psalm 22, and like, even though it may look like God, I have been abandoned, or God is not with me, he is with me.
Even though I die.
I die.
Yeah.
And so we have Daniel here in the same way. While it looks like God has abandoned, like, still
Right.
my faith is strong in this. And wherever that leads, I stand in that. And I think, as you talk about, like, what does that mean for us? I mean, I think that's, what does it mean to stand in our faith today? Or how do we become influencers, as you say, through all that, and what does that look like?
Yeah, and I think I guess I'm just trying to say I think it's different than we sometimes think what it would be. Well, if we had a bigger platform, or if
Well,
we had,
if we were king, then we could really have the influence that we want.
right.
Or have like this is influence.
Have our person as king. Right?
Yeah, it's influence from below instead of influence
exactly
from above.
It's influencing the things that we have control over.
Well, and in some ways, it's probably, the king is trying to enforce everything down, and it's not working.
Right.
It's obviously not working, because you have these Jews that obviously want to do a different diet, and we're going to see later on that it's still is the king's pushing it down, and they're still bucking the system.
Yeah.
Like if it comes from necessarily from above, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to rise from below.
Right. So that's what I think is one of the lessons, at least, we could draw from this. Do you notice anything else in the text, or do you have any other questions that you're left with? Any other lessons you see that we draw from this, or?
I think this is a personal thing for me. I think the wisdom thing is important. You know what I mean? Like, this is what opens the door for them is wisdom. It wasn't scheming. It wasn't political maneuvering. It wasn't anything like that. It wasn't, well, if I say this, then they do that and all that stuff. It was relying on God, which God opened the door for them to, live out this different eating style that opened the door. But then God blessed them with wisdom, like wisdom and understanding. And not, it's not just knowledge, it's understanding literature and everything else. Like there is a book, a literal book knowledge here,
right?
That makes them valuable. And like it's their perspective is valuable on that. And so how do we become valuable?
Yeah.
I think that to me is something that's that kind of sticks out to me, is like there's value in knowledge. Yes, I mean, they could have just remained faithful and bucked the system, but like there's also that value of the knowledge that opens doors for them.
And going back to your point earlier, I think even their ability to know what God had said. How do they know, I'm not going to eat this non-kosher food? They know what the Word of God says, and not only do they know what it says, but they say, we are absolutely going to follow it. We're not going to follow man-made rules. We're not going to follow these pagan rules. We're not going to conform ourselves to the culture, but we're going to stand
also
apart.
We have to acknowledge they're teenagers.
Yeah, right. Imagine that.
I know myself as a teenager couldn't be like that.
Yeah.
And it is different culture and so forth. They're kind of going, are we raising our children to be as firm?
Right.
Because you and I were talking before this about milk and solid food.
Yeah.
Like Daniel, obviously, it's solid food. It's not it's not it's my parents' faith. Like this is his faith that he is living out to the point of potential death.
Yeah. And you got to remember in this context, at least to my understanding, that young Jewish boys would have been taught from the time they were very young the Torah. They would have been not forced, but they would have been in a situation where they memorized, beginning often with the book of Leviticus is typically where they began first, but they would begin to memorize the entire scriptures. And so these were things that were part of in their heart.
Yeah. And I like what you said, in their heart.
Yeah.
This wasn't knowledge for knowledge sakes.
Right.
This wasn't
Bible bowl kind of stuff.
It wasn't Bible bowl. It was embodied living.
Right.
It was theology that informed how I live my life. And is there any greater faith than a faith that is challenged and still held to it, even in the face of adversity?
Right. This reminds me several years ago, and this was, this was soon after 9/11, and everybody was trying to understand Islam. And I read a book about the Quran, and it was very interesting to me because he talks about, and I didn't know this until then, that young Muslim boys in faithful households memorize the Quran in Arabic, right? That'd be like us memorizing the New Testament in Greek, for example. But the surahs they start with, the parts of the Quran that they start with, are those that have to do with the cleanliness rituals. And I found that interesting and I thought about that a lot. And again, I knew the same thing with Leviticus but it's almost like while you're doing the rituals, while you're washing your hands for the meals, maybe the parents are are reciting this part of the Torah, as we wash our hands, here's how we do it. And it's when you said it embodied, that's a real embodied kind of, faith. I think when you're saying these are the reasons we do these things, these are the reasons we cut our beards the way that we do. This is the reason we eat the way that we do.
It's you're getting rid of the dualism. Like everything is sacred in some ways, and so like how you live your life.
Well, the feast too.
Yeah,
we've talked about that. And at least the modern, when you have Passover, the youngest child in the room is the one who says, "Why is this night unlike any other?" And they recite the story of the Exodus. So yeah. Something you do.
I'm not saying we should be Jewish, but I just think we talked about this. There's something to that. Like there's something.
The repetition and the stories, we've talked about repeated stories. So, by the time you're 10 or 11, you're going to know the story of the Exodus, the largest redemptive story in the entire Old Testament. Here's where I think we do it in our congregations. And I think it's a good thing. It's when we do the repeated things like the Lord's Supper. And we repeat the words of institution, and I don't know how your guys' context is, but ones where, somebody's supposed to come up with some devotional thought about communion, right?
Yep.
And you're trying to be creative.
Oh, of course.
Yes. I was watching South Park the other. No, I don't know. Whatever. I was.
I've heard some
pretty outlandish ones.
Good ones.
I've heard some really good ones too. Yeah,
and
don't
when I
get me
say
wrong.
good ones, I mean some doozies.
Well, I've heard some that I can still remember that were very meaningful. But a lot of times it's like, well, creativity. This is not a creativity part. This is a part where really we're reciting and we're saying again these words so that they become a part of us. This is the body of Christ broken for me. This is the blood of Christ poured out for me, right? And we're remembering the institution. The night he was betrayed, Jesus took the bread, he blessed it, broke it, and said, "This is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." So, it's making that a part of us and going through the actions. And I think that there is something, and even, depending on our learning styles, I suppose, but there's a lot to be said for things that we memorize while we're participating. I always say things like Passover, things like the Lord's Supper are full, they're immersive events, right? We smell, we taste, we touch, it's involving all of our senses. So anyway, but yeah, it's just kind of got a little afield there, but going back to this, for Daniel, I think this was something that he knew well. And he says, I'm going to stay true to my God and to what he has commanded me. And that's, what would you want of your teenager?
Right. And that is its own influence.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Brian, thanks so much.
Yeah,
I'm excited.
no
It's a good kickoff.
Yeah, I enjoyed
Part
enjoyed
2, Daniel 1. Introduction.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop talking. So this is the second episode of Daniel. It was great. And, excited to continue to work through this and see what Daniel has else to teach us.
See if there are any lessons we can learn from Daniel.
If you're joining the Bible Bistro, you can, feel free to follow us, subscribe on Apple Podcasts.
Yep.
Share. We love a good share. Share
follow
with friends.
You follow us on YouTube as well if you want to see what we look like when we do these things.
On there. Again, as I mentioned, I'm working on a new website to maybe help provide some more resources, some books that we would recommend, something like that on some of the topics we've talked about.
You've been talking about finding some books on Daniel that I would recommend. So I meant to bring one. I forgot.
That's all right. We'll get it. Or you can also click on there to at the top of our webpage to support us if you like the work. So we can make more trips to Bistro, West and East and all the thing in between. So, well, Brian, thanks so much.
Yeah.
And look forward to seeing you next Tuesday.
All right. We'll see you, Ryan.
Bye.